Good morning from Finland. I don't know what time you are living in. My name is Virve Repo. I'm from Tampere University, Finland. And the picture here does not really relate to carceral riskscapes. It's just to illustrate why I'm not, for example, giving this presentation from our balcony. It has been snowing a lot recently here in Finland. I could also talk about confinement caused by snow, but not today. So I'm talking today about the carceral riskscapes and working in the spaces of mental health care. I work in a unit of social research at the moment, but my background is in geography. This article is part of the project called Spaces of Confinement in the Institutions of Care and Control in Finland, funded by Academy of Finland, and part of my thesis confined to space perspectives on carceral geography, which is available online. And this study was focused on geropsychiatric ward in Turku, Finland, where most of the patients were in need of psychiatric care, but there were also cognitively impaired patients who did not have place in proper care facilities. And in a way, they were in a wrong place in the beginning with, because the personnel did not have skills to treat them properly. In 2016, the journalist had a hint of a mistreatments that were happening on the ward. And these reveals led to inspections of National Supervisory Authority of Welfare and Health, and further to police investigations and further to trials. Several prosecutions were set, for example, for violation of official duty, mainly for over-medicating the patients and rough handling, but also an assault and grievous bodily harm and deprivation of liberty. 2 of the prosecuted nurses got sentences, which were disallowed later in Court of Appeal, mainly because it could not be proved that these mistreatments have been done in purpose. Now, I'm not going to go in specific details of these mistreatment cases in this presentation. They are included more thoroughly in my previous article about carceral layers, which also discusses about the layered ontologies of the carceral, if you are interested in that. But in this case, the research questions were, how are carceral riskscapes formed in a psychiatric ward? What effects do they have on life in institutions? And I took the viewpoint from the personnel, basically because the earlier article that I mentioned from this material was focusing on the care of the patients, and partly also because I wanted to study how these mistreatment cases were enabled by the personnel. The material here was purely documental, mainly because the ward was closed soon after the mistreatment cases were revealed. Some of these materials were available freely, some of them after signing a confidential clause. The internal report here was the hardest piece to get, since the city of Turku tried to deny the use of it, and it was available only after a local news agency took the case to the court. So there was going on some secrecy around this case from the beginning with, and some things were trying to swipe under the carpet, so to say. Well, yes, I will use the concept of carceral riskscape here to study the connection of carceral and risk and how these carceral riskscapes could influence on the well-being of work and care in this particular institution. Something about carceral first. Well, I think most of us know what carceral is, but I lean on the Dominic Moran and others definition that includes detriment, intention, and spatiality, but also included the carceral logics that allow some parts of the population to be confined in specific spaces, such as institutions. Then something about the scape. According to Appadurai, scape can be seen as imagined world. And as Salazar puts it, it can be a scene where something happens. And there are also spatial and temporal aspects related to these scapes. Then something about risk. We all have to deal with some kind of risks in our mundane life. We have to ponder some options, what to do and what to not. But risk is relevant, especially in connection to carceral spaces, since people who are risk to themselves or others may end up in these spaces. And in institutions, these risk assessments are done constantly by staff members and authorities and lawmakers. Risk is also related to spatiality and temporality, since, in my opinion, some spaces are more risky than others. And it may also relate to the schedules of the institution and the diurnal rhythm. In institutions, some of the physical spaces are especially designed to prevent risks, for example, seclusion rooms. But yeah, you may have lots of opinions if they really prevent the risk or increase it. And here at the bottom of the slide, there is a concept of riskscape. And this is a concept by Detlef Müller-Mann and others, and it has been used a lot, for example, concerning environmental hazards. I'm using it here as a little bit modified starting point for a concept of carceral riskscape. And these 6 dimensions are in the original definition of the riskscape, but I have included spatiality and temporality to the other dimensions, and I'm not going to, or I have not used them as these separate dimensions. Here it is kind of illustrated how I see the concept of carceral riskscape. So it is a combination of the carceral and the riskscape, including, as I said, the spatial and temporal aspects, which are related to both of these, both of carceral and riskscape. And as you see, there are still several dimensions which I have borrowed from the original riskscape concept, and I will next briefly explain their meanings. Yes, well, the first, the spatiality and temporality, they are not easily separated from each other or from the other dimensions. And carceral spaces have influence on how the passing of the time is experienced, so it's a relevant thing to think about that. Then social practices, what is said and done, but also what is unsaid and undone. Since neglect and punitive ignorance may also lead to creation of carceral riskscapes. Then legal requirements and regulations affect to the formation of carceral riskscapes. And sometimes these practices, these social practices, are so So kind of a strict and strong in this institution that they became to policies. So then about subjectivities and social groups, carceral riskscapes are experienced individually, but they also might be related to social groups, like kind of a collective experience. Well, the power relations are, of course, really significant in the institutions, and there is in institutions there is this power thing going on, that a small number of people can make decisions that influence a large number of people. And there is also the power over people who are considered risky, so-called patients or inmates or whatever. And but there is also power relations between staff members, and these power relations are really important when you are thinking about the quality of care, for example. Plurality, really difficult word to say, is that people are always under influence of several of these riskscapes. And sometimes the spatial and temporal accumulation makes some spaces riskier than others, as I already mentioned. And the accumulation of these risks leads to that some people have to face more risks than others. So there is not equality on how people are facing the risks. Then to an actual case study, but before that, some ideas why I choose also to study work and staff members in this case. Well, working is a significant part of people's lives, and sometimes people choose to work in poor conditions and quit their jobs. And there might be, for example, economical reasons or fear of exclusion from these social groups. And then to the actual case study. Sorry. When the inspectors of National Supervisory Authority of Welfare and Health started to check the situation at the ward after the journalist has revealed some things, they wrote down that there had been formed a state inside the state where these distorted caring practices could be formed and continue. As per the dimensions of carceral riskscape, power relations were in a large role. There were conflicts between senior and junior staff members. Junior staff members were threatened that their contracts are not renewed if they don't follow these practices. Whistleblowers, there were many of them because people were so afraid, but those who had courage to say something to their superiors, those whistleblowers were bullied until the management transferred them to other wards for their own good. And these social groups and cliques excluded those who were not so keen to these distorted practices, like rough handling and over-medicating and so on, which caused moral burden for workers, but also physical burden, since they had to do most of the actual caring work. While the management did not react to the situation, the power relations shifted more and more to those who maintain the distorted caring culture on the ward. For example, in the night shift, some staff members wanted to sleep. So they were set to lock the patients inside their rooms. There were no toilets in the rooms, or over-medicate them to keep them calm, and they ordered other staff members, usually junior staff members, to take care of the ward while they slept. And this uneven workload and moral pressure influenced the staff members and led to unintentional misconducts, and also affected to the quality of care. So I'm really quick today, I see. Some concluding remarks, and there is an interactive relationship between carceral and risk. And for me, the concept of carceral riskscape offered a tool to understand the dynamics of the ward and how the carceral riskscapes are formed in the institutions. And what I found characteristics to carceral riskscape was that it is actually linked to inequalities. Some of the staff members had to face and deal with these several riskscapes, while others deliberately created them. And this is also strongly related to the care and control, in a sense that the risks often lead to some measures of control. But the point is from which viewpoint the risk is seen, whether you see the restless patients as a risk that interrupts your sleep during the night shift, or whether you see that locking patients inside their rooms is risky for the patients. One thing that was not possible to study time was the role of gender in these power dynamics, and this would be interesting to research in the future, I think. So thank you very much, and this article is an open access article, and you can read it from FENIA, the International Journal of Geography, if you are interested in.
I might open it for questions for a few minutes. If people have questions, you can put it in the chat room. In the room, if you have any questions.
Maybe I.
Yeah, Claire, please go ahead.
Or can you hear me? Hi, Virve. It's Claire Lockman.
Yes. Hey, hi. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. And yeah, we're just at that tail end of the face-to-face conference, and I think everyone's quite weary. But
Yeah.
really lovely to hear you and see you all here tonight, or well, this afternoon our time. I just wondered if you want to say more about how risk is conceptualized in terms of risk posed to staff versus risk posed to those who, or experienced by those who are in the mental health care system, and how that might be experienced differently and how it's framed as risk. That makes sense?
Yeah, I'm not, I didn't hear quite well, but could you repeat the last part?
Yeah, just how risk is conceptualized, how it's thought about, as well as how people think about relation to others.
Yeah, that is a really good question, and I think in care work in general, the idea of risk, it's really a concept that is seen differently in different fields and in different countries even. And of course there are quite strict laws also concerning to people who may be a risk to others or themselves. But basically in this case, I think the risk, and I know that the staff members have to do this kind of an evaluation or thinking, what is risk and how should I deal with this in the care work constantly. But in this case, the the staff members, those who were maintaining this mistreatment culture, they were seeing any changes or anything that could interrupt their practices, where they could just take it easy and sleep in the night shifts and not let the patients to bother them. They see those changes as a risk to their kind of a working culture. And this is why it was so distorted, from my opinion, because you should really think about the risks from the viewpoint of the patients, and not like this. But also the risk, if you think that everything is risk. I listened to Marina Richter's presentation yesterday about nursing homes. Then everything starts to turn out to be controlled very easily. Did I answer at all to your question?
That's great. And you might also, I don't know, Virve, if you know Indigo Dyer's work. She presented this.
Yeah.
Yeah, she talked about risk in a different context to how you're speaking of it, but it might be interesting. But I'm fascinated by the idea that people see risk to their working conditions too. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Do I have any other questions? Wonderful, thanks.
Yeah, I do have a question, a curiosity. I was wondering whether the patients do have family members that somehow enter the facility or interact with them, and how this affects the equilibrium and perhaps the risks in the institutions.
Yeah, thank you for the question. There was one case where especially the patient's relatives took this case also to newspapers after the journalist has revealed, and this was quite harsh case, because the patient was mistreated in this ward, and he had broken ribs and things like that. So, but there wasn't so much that the patient's relatives could do about this, and that's why they contacted to the newspapers. The relatives have specifically asked not to put their relative to this ward, and city still did that. And it was this is an extreme case, of course, but I hope that this kind of cases don't happen anymore, but I'm not so hopeful with that. So, yeah.
So much. Any more? One last one. We have one more question.
Just one quick question, perhaps. You mentioned the difficulty of obtaining access to official documents. I think that's something many of us would be familiar with. I'd just be interested to hear any more detail that you might have to offer on how that access worked. I know you said that the institution was taken to court, but in Finland, what are the specific legislative or legal mechanisms that you have to go through to obtain these documents? That would be interesting to hear.
Yeah, well, the trial documents are open for everyone, actually. And the police examination reports I got when I asked from the police, and I had to sign this closure, and there are some legal restrictions how to use them, but otherwise, well, yeah, actually this internal report that I was talking about, this should be also an open access document, but because the city of Turku knew that there is some false going on. They didn't want to give me that. So I kind of argued with their lawyer like really long time. But for me as a researcher, I don't have so many means. I don't have time or money to take the case to the court. So luckily the news agency did that, and then they had to give the report to everyone who wanted that. So basically, yeah, it's not a really difficult process in some cases, but yeah, but if they want to make it difficult, it can also be.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you all for your comments, and nice to see you all, even in virtual form, so to say.
Thanks, Virve, and love your work too.
Thank you.
Our second speaker is Ettore Asoni. Ettore's paper, it's titled Guantánamo and the US Penitentiary, the convergence between camps and prisons as institutions of confinement. Ettore, yeah?
Yes, thank you. Let me just share my screen real quick. Okay. Yes, thank you so much for the introduction. I am Ettore Asoni. I am a recently graduated PhD from San Diego State and University of California, Santa Barbara. Currently without an affiliation, hopefully not for long. And in my presentation today, I want to discuss with you the 20 years of history of the Guantánamo Bay detention camp, and specifically its transition from being a camp outside the jurisdiction of US courts into just another form of detention in US law. But the reason that I want to discuss Guantánamo is not so much to give a presentation of Guantánamo per se, in as much because I want to take this site as a case study to analyze the geographic literature over confinement, in the sense that I find that Guantánamo and its trajectory offer us with an empirical reference to assess the state of the literature and specifically to discuss the intersections and divergences between different geographic subfields addressing confinement. And here I specifically focus on carceral geography and camp studies. Now, camp studies is really an interdisciplinary field, and yet it was strongly shaped by the contributions of political geographers. And I think that these two fields are probably the most significant and notable in the current turn toward confinement within the discipline that took place in this century. And so I will utilize Guantánamo's trajectory to draw some conclusion concerning the relation between these fields and the state of the literature. Now, very briefly, just let me attempt a comparison between camp studies and carceral geography. And of course, I will have to simplify things a bit here. But in general, I think that when we discuss carceral geography, and despite the heterogeneity of the contributions, the single most important factor in the work of carceral geographers is the usage of the carceral as a paradigm to investigate confinement, where the carceral works as an organizational model and a technology to govern mobility through coercion, so that the focus is never just on the carceral as isolation, but always as a technique and technology to govern mobility. And of course, the carceral is associated with the prison, but the point of carceral geography itself is that we can see this organizational model expressed in different settings, institutions, and sites, as we are seeing, of course, during this conference and in the previous presentation as well. While on the other hand, camp scholarship primarily focuses on the camp as a political technology, where the camp is historically associated with modernity in Europe and its colonies, and it has been adopted as an instrument to identify, confine, displace, or even exterminate populations. And so it is associated with the colonial camps, with camps for prisoners of war, concentration and death camps during World War II, and today, refugee camps. In this sense, the primary focus of camp scholars and how they define their field is the political function of the sites that they research, more than their organizational structure. And from these different approaches, however, there are a lot of intersections between the two fields, particularly due to their focus on mobility and exchanges between confinement sites, more than just isolation and remoteness. In this sense, the geographic gaze partly moves beyond the paradigm of the total institution, because here isolation is treated as only one outcome in a more complex technology to govern mobility. That is not to say that the total institution as a paradigm to investigate confinement is fully rejected, inasmuch that we appreciate how isolation and seclusions that characterize this paradigm are not necessarily the only result or the only feature of the carceral or the camp, as they coexist with the camp's ability to enter into relation and to have exchanges with other sites, which happen simultaneously. And even though carceral geography has probably developed this the most in theoretical terms, we see common trajectories in camp studies as well, particularly in the current focus within the discipline toward refugee camps. At the same time, an important difference is that camp scholars, at least most camp scholars, would tend to conceptualize the camp as ontologically distinct from the prison, and thus their object of research from prison studies. And this is primarily because the prison is historically an institution developed to act against individuals, while the camp explicitly targets population. Furthermore, the prison exists within the normal juridical order, and it is linked to criminal law and prison law, while on the other hand, the camp is mostly associated with a situation of exception from the law as well. At the same time, while this distinction is certainly sound historically, I believe that there are sites that complicate it, and Guantánamo's trajectory is precisely one of these cases. And it offers an empirical reference to investigate paths for a greater exchange across the two fields, particularly by complicating the distinction between camp and prison. And so now I will turn toward Guantánamo, and I will give you a brief sketch of its history. Now, Guantánamo opened in January 2002. In this map here, I highlighted some of the main camps, some of the main facilities of the broader camp that were opened and closed throughout its time. Today, only Camp 5 and 6 are operative. And Camp X-Ray was the very first facility to open in January 2002. And when the camp opened, the Bush administration had presented it as the legal equivalent of outer space. So a place that, due to its extraterritorial location in Cuba, was outside the jurisdiction of US courts, so that the prisoners would be under the power of the US military, but they would lack any legal means to litigate the legality of their confinement and imprisonment. And this led to several contributions by geographers and other scholars that primarily utilized the philosophy of Giorgio Agamben to conceptualize Guantánamo as a camp under the paradigm of the state of exception. And these contributions, by the way, were very influential in the turn toward confinement within geography that took place during the same century, and particularly for camp studies, because the very first works to be categorized under camp studies concerned Guantánamo. But in between 2004 and 2008, the legality of this circuit was put under scrutiny when the detainees' counsel began to argue that their clients had a right to habeas corpus, in other words, to have a court review the legality of their detention. And this led to harsh legal litigations that were ultimately ended in 2008, when the US Supreme Court decided that Guantánamo's prisoners enjoyed habeas corpus under constitutional grounds. This was also the year that Obama took office, therefore signaling a new period and a new era in Guantánamo and in the war on terror as well. And after the 2008 decision, what essentially has happened is that detainees have began to, have enjoyed the right to habeas corpus, and they were able to present petitions of habeas corpus in front of federal courts, therefore having federal courts deciding whether their detention was legal. At the same time, there is a big problem in the 2008 decision, because even though now detainees have a right to have a court review the legality of their detention, the Supreme Court never explained how could they determine what was legal, because this detention did not have a statute and did not have clear rules. So when the courts would examine the habeas cases, they did not know who could be legally detained, under what grounds, under what authority, evidence, or for how long. These were all unanswered questions, right? Questions that the courts had to answer as they went in the common law fashion, case after case, taking every case as an opportunity to answer a question, and then case by case constructing the law of detention in Guantanamo. And how did they do it? Well, essentially, what the courts did was to look at the rules concerning habeas corpus in domestic law, and therefore in confinement in imprisonment, in prison law, or the laws regulating detention, in immigration detention, in civil commitment, etc. By looking at this body of law, the court essentially constructed Guantanamo by deciding whether Guantanamo should follow or not the rules that apply to the domestic circuit. And of course, the habeas cases saw the detainees' counsel arguing that the court should apply domestic rules because their clients could not be detained under those rules, and the government urging the courts to treat Guantanamo as exceptional, therefore allowing them to detain people under rules that could not be applied in the mainland. And the courts essentially took a middle position, right, even though they leaned towards the government in most cases. So this normalized Guantanamo because as of today, really the law of Guantanamo makes Guantanamo just another form of detention in US law. And at the same time, this does not dispel its exceptionality, precisely because every rule concerning Guantanamo is conceptualized as an exception from the rules regulating domestic frameworks. And the main takeaway here is that here we can observe how Guantanamo's trajectory shows how the camp's variability to exist depends on its capacity to enter into relation with other sites, in the sense that the only way to make Guantanamo legal and to have it continue existing is to put it into relation with domestic legal frameworks, therefore integrating it within the domestic carceral circuit. And so the isolation and remoteness of Guantanamo, which are extremely harsh, particularly for the prisoners, can only continue to be reproduced if Guantanamo can take place within and not outside its circuit. And this is why I think it's such a great example to examine the geographic approach to confinement in different disciplines and in different fields. Because Guantanamo shows how isolation and connectivity are not contradictory. And of course, here I'm talking about the law, but we can expand our gaze here and discuss how Guantanamo has to have relations of exchange concerning personnel, capital, information, know-how that really integrates it within a larger network. And this is not in contradiction with the fact that Guantanamo continues to be a very isolated site, but that isolation is only an element in this structure. So that isolation and connectivity are not contradictory here, and they really reinforce one another. And of course, carceral geography has insisted on this point a lot when analyzing confinement. But as I was mentioning, camp studies may be on different terms, but in my opinion, they've done the same, particularly in the recent work concerning refugee camps, where they analyze refugee camps as networks that regulate mobility across routes. And another very interesting example is island studies, another interdisciplinary field, which is also, however, shaped by the contributions of geographers. Island scholars have stressed how insularity is a condition of isolation that the sea produces within an island by enclosing it, while at the same time, the same sea connects the island to other islands or to the mainland, therefore, again, insisting on how isolation and remoteness exists in a relation with connectivity and relationality and not as contradictory. And of course, this applies particularly well to Guantanamo, is the carceral island, and is also an idea that resonates with the concept of the carceral archipelagos, which is an idea that carceral geography has inherited from Michel Foucault, and which is still a protagonist in the current development within the field. And I think that this is really what we could call the geographic gaze to confinement, perhaps not exclusive to geography, but really one of the elements that resonates the most when we try to examine the very broad and heterogeneous contributions that were brought by this term toward confinement within the discipline. And so finally, what about the distinction between camps and prisons? Well, I think that this case study, Guantanamo, shows how this distinction varies at specific junctures, because I'll never say that camp scholars are wrong when they conceptualized the two institutions as different. And in fact, in 2002, you could definitely argue that Guantánamo was very different from the prison, had a different origin and a different function. At the same time, by really applying the same geographic gaze that I was discussing, then we can reach an understanding where the relation between camps and prisons is not paradigmatic or ideal, but it constitutes an historical relation, which changes precisely because camps and prisons are historical geographic formation, so that at specific junctures, the relation will change. And particularly in this case, we saw how Guantánamo did not become a prison, but as a camp is much more closer to a carceral circuit than to a prison than it was before. And here I am looking at it from the perspective of Guantánamo, but we could also change the point of view and look at the US penitentiary over time, how it changed its relations with other sites, which again, I think it's a really alive point, a point that is really alive in carceral geography and in this conference as well, right? There are a lot of contributors here that are examining precisely this, how the carceral can transition and how the relations between different sites and institutions can grow toward the convergence at specific junctures. And so ultimately, to conclude, I would say precisely this, that by taking this approach, which, by the way, is coherent with the geographic approach to confinement, then we can reach an understanding where, even though we keep the different approaches of camp scholarship or carceral geography of other fields as important, unique, specific, and necessary, we can also reach an understanding where cross-disciplinary exchanges are easier, and where we enter into an understanding where we relate different pieces of the literature based on the common geographic gaze. And I will conclude here. And again, thank you all. And I will take any questions if there are any.
Thank you. Wonderful. Any questions? Such a great paper. Yeah. Any questions? Any thoughts?
Anyone online first?
No, not at the moment.
I've got one, but then I don't want to dominate.
Let me just have a look. No. Okay. Claire's got one.
I know, sorry. Hello, Ettore, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. That's really interesting. I just, there are a couple of sort of questions / comments. One that, in looking at the distinction between, I mean, you're looking at the similarities between the prison and the camp, right? But in looking at the similarities, to what extent do we need to be attuned to the way that, regardless of the names we give these places, they are all part of the same continuum. And for all intents and purposes, even though there are these differences and intersections that you point out, Guantánamo Bay looks like a prison. I'm sure it feels like a prison at various points. Or would you say that there are times where you're arguing there are times where it's less like a prison, more like a camp? And what are the distinctions you would make, I guess, between a prison and a camp? What is there a difference, and what is that difference?
Yes, thank you. Well, I would say that you are certainly right, but I think that the point is the perspective that we use to classify them, right? Because I think that you are looking, you are seeing them as very similar because you are looking at the experiences, lived experiences of the people detained, which of course resonates with the experience of incarceration, and the techniques and technologies that are adapted in both places, which are definitely carceral techniques. And I think that this is really the carceral geographic conceptualization and approach to confinement. And so on that note, I would agree with you. But the reason that camp scholarship conceptualizes as different is not so much because they are entangled in a disagreement here, but because they choose to primarily focus on the political function of the institution, more than the common carceral techniques that exist in between different sites. And so from an historical perspective, they are kind of right in saying that the camp has certain peculiar characteristic that we should be careful not to conflate it with the prison too much, or else we would lose sight of the historical significance of certain sites. Because of course, and here I'm going more broadly than Guantánamo, you will see carceral techniques, for example, in concentration camps as well. There is a great book by Sofsky on terror, where he launches into an analysis of the temporal and spatial equilibrium of Auschwitz based on detainees, based on prisoners' testimony and memoirs. And of course, if you look at the techniques, then it opens up for a great analysis for carceral geographers as well. But I would say that it is also right to point out that we should avoid conflating a place like Auschwitz too much with the prison, or else we lose sight of its historical importance. And when it comes to Guantánamo in 2002, I think that there are arguments to say, wait a second, let's not conflate it too much, because otherwise we're losing sight of the fact that they're not just opening another prison, they're doing something very different with a different historical significance. And so when I'm trying to get these two fields into a dialogue, I'm saying they're not disagreeing on this issue. The different results that they have are due to a different perspective and approach, and both are valid and correct within their own horizon.
Right, that's really great answer. Actually, that's really, yeah, absolutely. There's different political purposes and functions. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah. Thank you. I was just thinking, so do I have another question before I ask mine? Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. And I mean, you know, you also made the point, nevertheless, that you know, these are historical and they context-based as well. So, you know, the shift between for example, the way the prison often, you know, can become the actual camp in itself. And what I mean that it's sort of kind of thinking through the state of exception, for example, you know, it's the production of their living, of their lives, you know, within the prison itself, through, for example, discussions of race and racialization and so on, which is, you know, which is very crucial here. And so I think you're also making that point. And in my work, like I actually did my thesis on camps, my PhD focused on camps. Once I finished my thesis, I then went into prison, and it's interesting because I actually find in spaces like the settler colony, like Australia, the state of exception often come into place, right? It comes to kind of form itself within prisons quite a lot, but also very early camps, like for example the Wabelina camp in Tasmania. It's a camp in itself, in a sense that it was formed through martial laws, state of exception, and so on. That it's also kind of functioning interesting like a prison, because it's for example it's trying to introduce, you know, this idea of reformation, you know, reforming indigenous prisoners and so on. So there is this kind of this mutation. They're not solid. They might be produced through particular means like the state of exception, but what they actually do, it's quite, you know, it's quite context based. And I think that's also part of the argument that you were making before.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think that the question that you're asking and the problem that you are identifying, I think that they are being discussed in the last years of contribution in camp studies, precisely because if we focus on concepts such as state of exceptions and camp as Agamben does, or in general, as philosophers would do. When we go and study empirical spaces, then we will always observe how theory doesn't always match with reality, right? Because if we take the state of exception or the camp as paradigmatic concept, not susceptible to change, then we don't have the means to analyze sites as the one that you are describing that evolve over time and complicate classifications that are too neat. I think that the most recent, like in the last 5-6 years, the most recent works in camp scholarship have addressed this by trying to go beyond Agamben while also not losing some of its most important principles, which I think more in general is always a good thing to do for geographers or in general for scholars who work on empirical cases, because we should never simply apply philosophers uncritically, given that philosophers work on pure concepts and so in order for the concepts to be applied to reality, there is always the need to get a certain room to maneuver. And yeah, I think that camp scholarship has done this, and they have shown we can keep certain intuitions from Agamben as valid without necessarily falling into the problem of not being able to account for the changes of the site that we study.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Any other question? Any other thoughts? Comments?
Just a quick one about that policy shift you mentioned, Ettore, in 2008 with regard to Guantánamo, and I'm interested as to whether cultural representations of Guantánamo or cultural representations coming from Guantánamo had any influence or fed into this policy debate and eventually the policy shift. I'm thinking of, in particular, of a 2007 volume of poems from Guantánamo that was published by University of Iowa Press, and I'd be interested to know if cultural productions like this played any role in this cultural debate, and I'd also be interested to know if they didn't come up, that would also be interesting. So your thoughts on this would be welcome.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, certainly they did play a factor, because what happened in Guantánamo since it opened until 2008 was that essentially the fight was launched mostly by lawyers. The US public really did not engage with it, and yet there were lawyers attempted to sway public opinion, perhaps more international public opinion than domestic public opinion, right? And the cultural production coming from Guantánamo were relevant for this, particularly because the Bush administration had also trained, of course, British individuals, Australians, individuals, Germans, individuals from countries that would be put under embarrassment by the fact that they would not be protecting their citizens, and also, and these detainees could get into connection with who could help putting out this material. And so, of course, the fight was ultimately legal, but a lot of it depended on how the criticism, how Guantánamo was able to sway public opinion to the point that it most likely affected the courts. If you're interested in this topic, by the way, there is a book that just came out, The War in Court by Lisa Jar, which analyzes these precise topics, like how the war against torture and detention developed in the 21st century in the US. And thank you for your question.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Ettore.
Thank you so much. Now moving to our final speaker. Blind as a bat, so if I don't have my glasses, it's not going to happen. And the final speaker is James Little, who will be presenting Agents of Memory, Ireland's literature of coercive confinement. Thank you. It's ready to go.
you already in jail, so you having difficulty, so.
Yes, sorry, I was muted. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Classic Zoom error, perhaps excused by the fact that it's quite early in the morning here in Dublin. So greetings everyone from Ireland, and thanks for allowing me to be part of this wonderful conference. So as my previous question indicated, my interest is in cultural representations of institutions of coercive confinement, and that's what I'm working on in University College Dublin. And I suppose picking up on an earlier concept we heard of the scape as an imagined world, I'll be looking at particularly theaterscapes of coercive confinement in Ireland in this paper. So in Act 1, Scene 10 of Mairead Ní Ghráda's 1964 play Intl, The Trial, the central character Moira is found in a laundry in a house of refuge for unmarried mothers. Having been kicked out of home by her mother, who discovered her pregnant, and dismissed from her job as a domestic servant for the same reason, Moira finds herself in a laundry where she discovers the first semblance of human kindness in the older inmates she shares the carceral space with. These women open this scene by complaining about their working conditions, echoing the evidence found in a recent oral history archive of survivors of Ireland's Magdalen laundries. And I'm just going to go quickly through a few parallels here. You can see Ní Ghráda's text in parallel with excerpts from the oral history archive, and I've highlighted Ní Ghráda's own English translation of her play in yellow. So the first parallel is that there are dangerous working conditions, including extreme heat in the laundry. The women perform a wide range of tasks of a commercial laundry, including fixing the clothing, cleaning it, sewing it, mending it, and so forth. There is inadequate sustenance. So what comes up in the oral history archive repeatedly is the lack of proper food and proper sustenance. In the play itself, it's focused rather on drink, and it seems to be an alcoholic drink referred to by the characters. So the parallel is not exact, but nevertheless it's there. What is a clear parallel, and what comes up time and time again in the oral history archive, is the lack of financial remuneration for the women's work, and this is stated clearly in the play when the women complain that they are working without pay. The women are not allowed regular contact with men, so this was a very much a gendered carceral space designed specifically for women, and there are multiple references to the doors and windows being locked by survivors who give testimony in the oral history archive. And this is why in the play that the arrival of a delivery man is such a huge event for the women. And the final parallel I'll look at is the wide range of Irish society for which they do this commercial laundry work. So in the play, we have the characters literally holding up for ridicule a pair of underwear, a politician's underwear. And I've just highlighted in red in the long excerpt from the oral history archive the range of different institutions that the women in the laundry did work for. So this paper examines how, in portraying conditions of work inside the Magdalen laundries, Ní Ghráda's play spurred contemporary debate on the treatment of confined women. And I'll contextualize this news headline a bit later on in my presentation. So it spurred debate at the time, and it has also continued to act as what I'll be calling an agent of cultural memory about Ireland's institutional abuse of these women. So Ireland's cultural memory of carceral institutions such as laundries and mother and baby homes has long been covered by what one contributor to a recent state report called a cloud of unknowing. And I would argue that the fact that writers such as Ní Ghráda were openly discussing these institutions in the 1960s shows that this process of unknowing involved a kind of active fostering of cultural ignorance rather than just, a passive act of blindness or forgetting. So with this in mind, today I want to focus on how plays and other cultural works such as Intl have been used and can indeed continue to be used to challenge this societal unknowing. So in order to do so, I'm going to zoom in on the question of agency and ask how a play like Intl can act as an agent for reflections on matters of public concern. In a recent book which questions the growing use of the term agency as a synonym for action in contemporary cultural discourse, Stephen Connor contends that agency, quote, has much more to do with a power to act and therefore not to act than with agency in the sense of simply doing things. I will argue that in acting as agents for future reflection on the subjects they stage, plays such as Intl offer us particular tools for the reinterpretation of our spaces and practices of care and control. And this is particularly relevant given the stated aim of the founders of the laundries to provide care for destitute women. Instead, as historians such as Frances Finnegan have shown in her analysis of what she calls the female penitentiary system, these institutions became institutions of control with precious little care. So my question is not just what did Irish writers do in response to the island's widespread network of carceral institutions, which in the 1950s confined a staggering 1% of the Irish Republic's population, but also what can be done with what they did? What can be done with these works in our continuing cultural debate about how we can find vulnerable people in society? So for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to focus on agency on 3 levels. First, I'll look at the author as an agent of meaning who made the play. Then I'll look at agency as it is represented in the play itself. And finally, I'll examine the play's legacy briefly as an agent in cultural debates about coercive confinement. So in an interview looking back on her composition of the play, Ní stated that she had the subject matter of Intl in mind a long time before writing it. She remembers in this interview growing up in the west of Ireland, hearing of a local woman being kicked out of her parish in County Clare because she had become pregnant. The incident was so etched on her mind when she came to write the play 6 decades later that the writing process itself went relatively quickly. Over the course of these 6 decades, between witnessing the expulsion of her neighbour and writing a play about it, Ní became a major cultural force in Irish life. As well as being the first radio broadcaster in Britain or Ireland, first employed as a woman organiser in charge of a children's programme on Radio Éireann, then her post changed to regular announcer, and these are both quotes of her position titles, in charge of news and music programming. She was a key member of the Irish language movement, and she was central to the establishment of Dublin's first dedicated Irish language theatre space, which I'll show you a grainy photo of here. This is the Damer Hall, where Intl premiered in 1964. Ní had written an earlier play about coercive confinement, so this was a long-running interest of hers. And this earlier play focused on hunger-striking nationalist prisoners during Ireland's War of Independence, in which she was an active participant. The play's title, Stalk Ucrash, Hunger Strike, turns up in the minute books of Ireland's Abbey Theatre as early as 1939. However, this controversial early play, whose ending undercuts the ideology of self-sacrificial nationalism, was never staged in the state-sponsored Abbey Theatre. Instead, it had to wait until 1962 before being presented to the public in the Damer Theatre. And the point I'm making here is a point about performance space and cultural platforms, because as theatre scholars, we know that there is no way for theatre makers to be agents of social change without a space in which to stage their work. And I think it's no coincidence that the small independent Damer Theatre quickly became the platform for Ní most damning critiques of Irish society, such as Intl in the final decade of her long writing career. And there are other examples I can go into detail about later if you wish. So Intl makes its audience the jury in a trial, asking us to deliver judgment based on the evidence we see on stage. A schoolgirl, Moira, is seduced by a local schoolmaster, who then abandons her to the mercy of Irish society when she becomes pregnant. And this is an aspect that came up in Ní reminiscence of the girl she remembered being kicked out of her town as a child. Having been evicted by her mother, she is first employed as a house cleaner before her employer finds out about her pregnancy and kicks her out too. She then works in a laundry where she refuses the advice of a social worker to give up her child for adoption, which occurred to 97% of children born outside of marriage in 1960s Ireland, and this was the highest such adoption rate in the world at the time. Finally, she meets her former partner in a brothel where he rejects her once more, calling her a striepach, which translates as whore, and this leads Moira to end her own life, as well as the life of her child, stating, "My child is free, she'll not be the easy fool of any man." The play garnered widespread praise from critics, including rave reviews in major Anglophone newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic, and was quickly translated into English for screening on Ireland's state broadcaster. However, not all were satisfied with how Moira's story was presented, and here is critic Eamon McSwivna writing soon after the premiere. And I'll read the original and leave the translation for you on screen. Ein ni arina an Colleen rinneshi dod yon feine. I fein hulig an paca ienov agus I fein chafive fragruk as. I fein agus an far. Kurter gakrod san orov mar inisha, ach ni hugter einge don seerhul atá a gacéine. So McSwivna's critique here resonates with both the tone and I would argue the perspective of the Irish State's 2021 report into mother and baby homes, which repeatedly states that women were not forced into giving up their babies in spite of plentiful evidence to the contrary. The following set of sentences in its executive summary is typical of the confused logic throughout the report. There is no evidence that women were forced to enter mother and baby homes by the church or state authorities. Most women had no alternative. Intl stages how taking away someone's alternatives amounts to a form of social coercion. And I think Dominique Moran's concept of coerced mobility would certainly be relevant in this regard. Moira makes it clear that she does not want a relationship with the older married school teacher. She is seduced. She does not want to leave her family home. She is forced into doing so. She does not want to enter into a house of refuge or to give up her child to a foster family, but is left with no real alternative to live her life otherwise. If we follow Connor's description of agency as the power to act, it is clear that Moira has the power to act only in a certain manner. So much for agency within the play. How has Intl functioned as an agent in cultural discourse? Well, some critics have contended that Ní Ghráda was freer to critique Irish society's treatment of single mothers because she was writing in the Irish language, which has continued to be supported by the state. However, Intl needs to be seen in the broader context, I would argue, of growing attention regarding institutional abuse and discriminatory practices towards single mothers at this time. So to give you a few examples, 3 years earlier in 1961, the Abbey Theatre had staged an English language play about institutional abuse in residential schools. And in the same month that Ní Ghráda's play was staged, the Irish Times newspaper carried a series of investigative reports by journalist Michael Viney into the adoption of single mothers' children. And this gave rise to the newspaper headline I showed you earlier, where Ní Ghráda's play is compared to Viney's journalistic investigation. So while being written in Irish certainly has had influence on the ways in which Intl was received, we need to be careful, I think, about attributing separate status to works written in one of the island's minority languages. Especially after its translation, Intl was part of a broader conversation on Ireland's institutions of confinement, and indeed it continues to be. Perhaps surprisingly, given the Irish language's minority status in Ireland, the Irish language version of Intl has found its way to far more readers and viewers than its English language translation. The English text is now out of print, while the Irish version is still widely available and widely read. Intl is on the syllabi of the final state exams for secondary school students in both Northern Ireland and the Republic, and regular productions for these audiences have contributed to Ní Ghráda's drama being the most viewed Irish language play ever written. Other theatre writers dealing with Ireland's history of coercive confinement have used Ní Ghráda's play as a model. So Patricia Burke-Brogan's 1988 play Eclipsed, which shows the systematic dehumanization of women confined in a Magdalen laundry, uses the figure of Elvis Presley as a romantic icon in a way that directly recalls the behavior of the women in the laundry scene of Intl. And again, I can go into more detail about this later if you wish. And Celia Dufresne has written a play to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Negroda's Intl. So though a minority language work in a medium which necessarily has limited audiences, Intl continues to function as an active agent of memory in Irish culture. And given the recent widespread critiques of state reports into Ireland's mother and baby homes and Magdalen laundries, critiques which targeted in particular the ways in which survivors' voices were sidelined in the official reports, works like Intl continue to be crucial to Irish cultural memory. And I've highlighted a few recent examples of Ireland's literature of coercive confinement published since 2020 on this closing slide, which I'd be more than happy to talk about in the Q&A. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. What an interesting presentation. Any questions?
One over here. And
Yeah, please go ahead.
Speak up.
Yeah, you can speak up.
Yeah, that was a fantastic presentation. That's all. I was really interested in the excerpt that you showed about the report that was denying the extent of the carceral institutions in Ireland and other baby homes that you mentioned.
Yeah.
What is the kind of public conversation today in Ireland about those places? Like, is there recognition about those practices and those places of confinement? What's the status of things now?
So the sound is a little shaky, but I think I hear the question as what the cultural conversation is in Ireland about these institutions.
Yeah, that's correct. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for the question, and it's a really important question, and I would say quite an important conversation. So essentially over the last decade or so, we've had a series of state reports into institutional abuse in institutions that were run by the church and state in Ireland, ranging from residential schools to laundries, mother and baby homes, and these reports have in turn sparked critique, particularly from survivors of the institutions, who feel that the reports, in different ways for different reports, don't adequately address the abuse that they suffered. So the first one, and perhaps the best, an early report, which you might be interested in looking at, is known commonly as the Ryan report. There was then a McAleese report into Magdalen laundries, and in 2021 there were reports north and south of the border on mother and baby homes, and in the north on mother and baby homes and Magdalen laundries. So the debate as it stands is framed on the adequacy or inadequacy of these official state responses, and this is where I think cultural works have an interesting role to play in challenging official discourse, and also with a play like this one, looking at how issues of institutional abuse were already being discussed, as early as the 1960s, and what was or wasn't done in relation to these reports. If you're interested in the topic, I know that Rachel Andrews will be presenting on this topic later in the day in a panel on the Tune mother and baby home. So that might be of interest to you. But that's how I see the interaction between official and creative discourse working in Ireland. I hope it answers the question.
We have another question here, please go ahead.
I was wondering if I could speak to a bit about where this place sits within like the broader context of women's prison theatre. So thinking about sort of the work of Clean Break in the UK, and their sort of like radical roots and then sort of like reformist journey. And I was wondering if sort of where this place sits within that that legacy.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I don't know. Is it Clean Break? Did I hear it correctly?
There's only, I think there are like 2 dissertations published on them, but there's like
Great.
more academic work being produced. So it started off as a feminist theatre company that began like in prisons run by incarcerated women, and then it became kind of got assimilated into like the charity industrial complex and became more supportive of the prison system. And now at the moment it's kind of once again developing, going back to its roots of critique. And I think they've done work in the north of Ireland, but I don't think they've ever crossed the border outside of UK.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot. I don't know their work, but I'll certainly look it up, and it's it certainly sounds relevant to what I'm doing. I mean, one thing that has come up in recent years is the growing use of immersive theatre practices to stage these and to, I suppose, imaginatively recreate the conditions of confinement. So there's a very well-known theatre group in Dublin called Anu Productions, who have staged different institutions of coercive confinement, and famously the Magdalen Laundries themselves. And there has been some work done on how theatre scholarship, on how the different aesthetic strategies with regard to immersive or participatory theatre practices are, they vary across the islands of Britain and Ireland. So I'm aware of that work, but I hadn't heard of Clean Break before, so I'll definitely check them out. And thanks a lot for the information.
I hadn't heard about it before, so we've done an exchange, and I'm going to go and look at that.
Great, thank you.
Excellent. Any more questions? Any more thoughts? I was actually gonna. Oh, go ahead. No.
I was going to ask more about those books, but you go. Yeah.
I was just gonna ask you a bit more about the way it's become part of the curriculum in schools, because that in itself would have been like a major kind of battleground, like to get that sort of publication in the curriculum. We see a lot of struggles in Australia to get, particular texts and particular histories, and so I'm wondering, how was that?
Thanks for that question, because I too think it's key, and we can all probably think of experiences or texts that we read in school that have significant impacts, and on a basic level it certainly widens the audience, right, for these kinds of works. And it certainly, as I said in the paper, contributed to Intl becoming a widely viewed and a widely staged play, because there is always going to be an audience for it once it's on the school syllabus. So to the best of my knowledge, it became part of the Republic of Ireland's Leaving Certificate in 2003. I did my final school exam in 2004, and it was on our syllabus. So our Irish teacher put it on our reading list, and that's how I first came across the play. So I mean, I'm a living example of how putting something on the school syllabus can get it into your mind and get you thinking about these issues. I'm not sure when it became part of the A levels. The Irish language isn't as widely studied in Northern Ireland for various historical and cultural reasons. But I do know that it is on that syllabus. So both North and South, it is available to students as a play to study. I'm afraid I can't give you more details on the particular dynamics of how that debate happened. But it is something I would be interested in looking into, and your question has definitely encouraged me to do that. So I need to talk to people who are involved in these boards and who made these decisions, and there should be a few of them around the university that I can find. So thanks very much for the encouragement with your question.
You're welcome. Any other question? Any other thoughts?
about those books, the other books, James, you've read those other books that about mum and baby homes at the end. I don't know whether you want to say something more about the books that you had on the last slide.
Yeah, I suppose it's just and I suppose this links back to the first question about the shape of the debate in Ireland. The fact that all of these books have been published, all four that I showed anyway, have been published since the pandemic, shows just how live a topic this is and what a resource it is for writers. So I don't know if I can quickly share the screen again, just so it's in people's vision as well as on their in their ears when I listen to it. But the play on the left, I'm Adele, is a play about abuse the author suffered in a residential school, or one of the authors. It's a co-authored play, and that just came out very recently. And The Mother House is a broader poetic reflection on various forms of mothering and motherhood, which includes a few poems that focus specifically on institutions, religious institutions. And Elaine Nichel Donan is one of our great poets, writing in both Irish and English, and it's well worth checking out. Claire Keegan's Small Things Like These is about the decision of a man in a small Irish town to take a girl out of a carceral institution and the kind of social knock-on effects this has. And Girls Like You is a memoir of a woman's experience in a mother and baby home in County Cork in the southwest of Ireland. And these were just four that I picked literally off the top of my head as I was putting the slides together. But the creative literature on this topic really is extensive. And again, to go back to the first questioner, this I think demonstrates the live nature of this topic, and the importance of these cultural representations as we deal with this topic as a society on the island of Ireland.
Thank you so much. And can we just thank all the speakers, please? Thank you. And I think this takes us to the end of the section, and well done, everyone. Fantastic papers, all three, very different but very interesting papers. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.